Good evening. Welcome to Roosevelt House. I'm Andrew Polsky. I'm the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at Hunter College and a Professor of Political Science at Hunter. I'd like to remind you, if I may, at the start, to please turn off or silence your cell phone, since almost always one will go off if I don't make that announcement. In the past, I've hosted events here at Roosevelt House on several occasions, and I always say at the beginning it's a fitting venue for the subject that we're talking about. Usually, though, it's because it's an event that concerns Franklin Roosevelt as president, and I'm a scholar of the presidency. So that's what I have been asked to do. Tonight is different. This is not an event about the presidency, but Roosevelt House is still a very appropriate setting for our conversation because its history is also one of an unusual relationship between a mother and her son. As you may know, Sarah Roosevelt, Franklin's mother, bought the property and built the two adjoining houses that form Roosevelt House today so that she could continue to live close to her son, Franklin, even after his marriage to Eleanor. And there are, in fact, the two houses are connected upstairs on a couple of floors. And Sarah Roosevelt could drop in on the family anytime she wanted to, and she did, much to Eleanor's consternation. So I cannot think of a better place for us to talk about two fascinating memoirs of the remarkable experiences of two boys who were raised by strong-willed mothers. When I first thought about interviewing the two authors, I have to confess there was one thing that concerned me deeply. It wasn't so much a nameless dread as the dread of a name, specifically the surname of one of our authors. And I became anxious at the thought that I was going to have to pronounce it in public. So let's get that out of the way now, if we can. It's pronounced Andreas. That wasn't so hard. I feel better. Peter Andreas, I have my straight person here in the front row. Peter Andreas is the author of Rebel Mother, My Childhood Chasing the Revolution. He has written or co-authored 6 other books and edited still others. He is the John Hay Professor of International Studies and Political Science at the Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs at Brown University, otherwise known as the Hunter College of Providence, Rhode Island. He's a graduate of Swarthmore. Peter earned his PhD at Cornell University. In addition to his books, he has written for such journals as Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The New Republic, Harper's, Slate, and The Nation. Much of his research and writing has explored international drug trafficking, other forms of global crime, and the efforts at policing these activities. Saeed Sayar-Fayazadeh, the author with the easy to pronounce surname, if you're Iranian, has written the critically acclaimed memoir, When Skateboards Will Be Free. He is also the author of the story collection, Brief Encounters with the Enemy, finalist for the 2014 Penn Robert W. Bingham Fiction Prize. His writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Paris Review, among others. Saeed teaches at NYU and at Hunter College in our remarkable creative writing MFA program. That's actually how we met several years ago. He teaches his course in the seminar room down the hall from my office, where I'm dean, so we have chatted many times. I am the one in this conversation who had the conventional upbringing, which is why I'm the moderator rather than one of the participants. It's now my pleasure to invite our two authors to join me here so that we can begin our conversation. Please. I just want to say here as we start that it's my hope that this conversation will be primarily between the two authors. This may be the only question I have the opportunity to ask, but I would like to begin by noting that you were each born during the political upheavals of the 1960s, and I'd like you to each start by talking a little bit about how those events affected your parents and your family.
How much time do we have, guys? Yes, the political upheavals of the 1960s. Here's the thing. So the political upheavals for my family actually began earlier than that. 1953 in Iran. You guys know what I'm talking about? That's right. The overthrow of Mossadegh by the CIA. My father came to the US in 1954, met my mother on a tranquil college campus at the University of Minnesota. They married, and then in the 60s, became involved in an organization called the Socialist Workers' Party. Does that ring a bell to any? Okay, all right, that's good. All right, so I'm in good company here. And they became incredibly radicalized. And part of the radicalization is being a member of a fringe organization that put an immense amount of demands on their time, allegiance, political thinking. I mean, my childhood was filled with meetings and being dragged, at the age of 4, meetings and forums and demonstrations and petitionings. So there was sort of a dual thing happening with the family, which was the outside events of the world, the Vietnam War, et cetera, but also the demands of the Socialist Workers' Party, which doesn't cease regardless of what's happening in the outside world. It's still going strong.
Okay.
Peter.
Well, there's definitely some parallels to that story, but also quite different. It doesn't begin in Iran. It begins in a small Mennonite town in central Kansas. North Newton, Kansas, population 5,000. Population 5,000, North Newton, Kansas. My parents are Mennonites. Everybody in town's a Mennonite. They go to the Bethel College, which is the Mennonite college where everybody goes to if you're Mennonite going to college. And that's where my parents, actually no, my parents met before that. My father was 21, she was 14. Even then it was, frowned on a bit. But the radicalization did not happen until the 60s. And so Said's story is one in which it's a joint effort. The parents are radicalized together. In my case, the family's torn apart by radicalization. My father remains a pacifist Mennonite, opposed to the Vietnam War. That's where they have a similar political agreement. But my mother gets a PhD in sociology, starts hanging out with Black Panthers and Trotskyists and Maoists and so on, organizes all sorts of demonstrations and marches, becomes a feminist in the 60s as well, and starts to actually root for not just protest the Vietnam War, but starts rooting for the Viet Cong. And from my father's perspective, that's a complete no-no. So they had a political and personal schism that tore apart our family. I was a mistake. I was basically, born in the midst of her writing her dissertation. The last thing in the world she probably wanted was another child. My 2 older brothers, 8 and 9 years older than me, were already radicalized at an extraordinarily young age. They were vegetarian hippies at age 11 and 12. As a prank, they put the Viet Cong flag up their elementary school pole. This is, we lived through the riots in Detroit in 1967. Anyway, so the family's torn apart. I will stop there because we have more to talk about. But so my story is really one about a family shaped by the political events, but also torn apart by them in a way that wasn't quite the same as Said's story.
So as the subtitle of your book suggests, she literally chased the revolution. And so where did that take you?
Yeah, again, incredible parallels with Said's story, but one difference is constant movement. And constant movement not just across states, but across countries. So first, she was refused divorce, and therefore she picked up her 3 kids and moved to California, to Berkeley, in 1970, without my father knowing where we were. But it turned out Berkeley was just a little too liberal, hippie saturated. Everyone agreed with each other that the Vietnam War is a bad thing. She wanted to be on the front lines of the revolution, so she took me with her to Chile in 1972, a year before a military coup deposed the socialist, popularly elected president there. We went on to Argentina, to Peru. She fell in love with a young revolutionary half her age who we lived with in a one-room apartment for quite a while. We moved back to the United States. She lost custody of me, then actually kidnapped me because of that. And we moved back to Peru. So basically, between the ages of 5 and 11, 3 states, 5 countries, a dozen schools, a dozen homes, and all of it driven by intensely personal political struggles.
And you, Saeed, ended up being raised by your mother for a different reason.
Yeah, you know, I'm not used to feeling like my story is less interesting than someone else's, so you know, you want to just keep talking.
I am.
I'm sorry, Andy, what was the question? It was...
How did you end up being with your mother? Because you mentioned your parents were both radicalized at the same time.
That's right. Yeah, so, well, my parents separated. My dad left home when I was 9 months old. Here's some strange parallels. We're both the youngest of 3 children. Parents have separated. We both grew up with our mothers. So my dad did not fight for me the way your dad fought for you. That's a very compelling part of your book. I mean, he really wanted you. I'm not giving anything away by saying there's a couple chapters in the middle of the book when Peter gets to live with his dad. You were around the age of... Yeah, okay, that's right. He finally gets custody of you. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is so good. This is like now he's made it. I mean, because you were living, you had a stability there. And then mom kidnaps him. And then the fun starts again. But yeah, so I have a brother and a sister, but I did not grow up with them, similar to Peter. They grew up with my dad. I lived with my mom. I was born in Brooklyn, but she ended up moving to Pittsburgh when I was 7. So it was just the 2 of us. We lived there. Here's another big difference between, and this is a huge difference. Your mom had a lot of sex. No, she had boyfriends, and my mother, after my dad left, never dated again, from the age of 35. Did I ask her this? Mom, how's the sex life? No, I know her. I was with her. There was never anybody else.
They both spent a lot of time in one-room apartments.
That's right. Yes. I knew. Yes, she was. But you know, she never got over my dad. I love how the audience is just yelling out questions. This is great. No, but yes, she never got over my dad. In fact, remained married to him for a while so that he could remain legally in the country because he wasn't a citizen. And of course, meanwhile, he went off and he was having fun, political fun. But she ended up living a very isolated life. It was just the 2 of us. And that's another area in which our lives diverge, our histories diverge.
Absolutely. I should back up a bit and say, Saeed's book was an inspiration for me. I mean, basically, when I finally got around to saying, okay, I'm going to write this book, enough time's passed, I need to do it. I already have tenure, I don't have to worry about that anymore. So, I picked up his book, and it was truly inspiring, and to my great surprise, there's not a lot of books out there kind of like our 2 books. I'm constantly puzzled by that. But anyway, back to the mother story. Yeah, my mother lived life to the fullest. I mean, she really, personally, politically, and she saw these 2 things as completely interlinked. So boyfriends she would break up with for political reasons as much as personal reasons, and vice versa, right? And go ahead.
No, but was your mother sad? I mean, she doesn't strike me as a sad person. Did you feel that she was sad or depressed?
She had depressive moments.
Okay.
But in general, she was pretty passionate about the life and world, but she could be emotionally volatile. And
Okay.
there was a point in the book that I write briefly where she unfortunately shared with me, Peter, I'm thinking of killing myself.
Oh, right.
And it was because it turned out that her new Peruvian husband, half her age, she discovered had an affair. And philosophically, she actually was not committed to monogamy. But in practice, it was a difficult pill to swallow when you're cheated on. And so he was not around at that moment when we were talking over the dinner table. And so she got really down. She also got down about the state of the world. I mean, the world was not moving in the right direction at some point. And, and it weighed heavily on her. I mean, I'm thrilled. She died very suddenly, unexpectedly at the age of 71 in 2004, and I'm just thrilled she never saw the rise of Donald Trump, because it would just, it would have just killed her. I mean, seriously. But frankly, having said that, she also would have been mobilized and been on the front lines of fighting it. But yes, she lived. And I mean, yeah. No, I remember your book well. There was a sadness about your mother.
Yeah,
There was a
my mother
sadness
very
about your
sad.
mother.
She was
Yes.
My mother was sad, depressed. I mean, clinically depressed, and scared of the world. And part of what the socialist workers, and this is, by the way, a huge difference between our two stories, is that I had a political organization that I was involved in, and I don't think there's no mention of any. I mean,
Right.
she was not. She would just kind of join boycotts and write letters and try to organize, but she was not part of a party.
She purposely did not join a party because she was, for whatever reason, 100% committed to gay rights. And at the time, no mainstream Marxist organization accepted gays and lesbians. And so she wrote, I have this dialogue in the, I don't know about the Socialist Workers' Party.
We would have welcomed, we welcomed gays.
Interesting.
Sure, yeah.
Interesting. So she wrote, I have this dialogue that I reproduce in the book where she's basically arguing with the Marxist-Leninist organization of, in Chicago headquarters, and they write her back saying, she's basically saying lesbians are gonna be at the vanguard of the revolution. You guys need to get your shit together. You white men don't understand where the future is. And they wrote her back and said, no, we do not allow. And so what's fascinating is I don't have any recollection either in my memory or from her diaries ever talking about the Socialist Workers' Party. So it's almost like a East Coast, West thing, maybe. I don't know.
No, it's because the Socialist Workers' Party is just another small fringe organization that has no impact on anything, even though we thought we were going to be leading the working class. I mean, has anybody here ever bought a copy of the Militant newspaper? Thank you, sir. God bless you. All right, two people. All right, thank you.
They still sell them at Hunter College periodically. I see them.
Right.
I see them there.
But we were delusional and grandiose, and we really thought that we would be at the vanguard of the revolution, that we had the right ideas, our organization, and narcissistic, patronizing, that we knew the truth, and all of you people, except for you and you, were you were in the darkness, you were the sheep, we were going to lead you into the light. So that was a huge part of my life, was this party that my mother, and by the way, my father too, both members. So they were separated, but they were still members of this organization, and that was really our family. For me, felt like that was the family.
You describe it, you refer to it as a political party, but as I'm reading your book, it comes across as a cult, and frankly, in some cases, some of your description makes it sound a little bit, I have to say, like the Catholic Church. You describe how you were molested by a party member, and here I'm going to read something toward the end of the book when you went back to this. A few days later, the party found another place for the comrade to stay. What had happened was never mentioned in our home again. It was up to each of us to bear our private miseries alone until that glorious day in the future when it would all be resolved once and for all and a perfect world would emerge. Less a political party, as most of us would understand it, than as a cult.
Right. And then also the unhappy irony that this organization that is committed to righting wrongs in the world and injustices, and yet sexual abuse was something that was swept under the rug. And I think that sort of is a little bit of a heartbeat in the book, or a little thing that's pulsing through the book, was that that our grand ideas sort of didn't didn't always match up to the way we lived our lives.
Yeah, so I mean, one way to put it
So
is
by the
my
way,
mother
so good,
didn't-
thank God you were not in a political party.
I mean, there was no organization or party, but there was a lot of, echoes of, a lot of meetings and strategizing sessions. And my mother joined causes and movements, and so she worked for the United Farm Workers. I know that there's a story about lettuce in your book, and well, we were with that boycott at the time. My mother was at the forefront of the Coors strike in Colorado in the late 70s. She goes to Chile to not just write a book about women in Allende's Chile, but she then joins the party, the Socialist Party there. Yeah, she did. And then the coup came, and that was the end of that. But you're right. For the most part, she was not a joiner of parties where you go and, collectively, but there was a lot. I mean, there were places in Denver which basically headquarters of political meetings where you plan the next rally or the next protest or whatnot. Yep.
As I was reading these memoirs, I have to say there were a number of points when I thought to myself, wow, Children's Protective Services should have removed this kid from the home for child neglect. Is my reaction unfair?
I was thinking the same thing.
How do you think readers should view your mothers and the way they treated you?
Well, I have to say, that's what I was thinking when I was reading your book, Peter.
Right.
There's a very, I want to get, there's the moment in the courtroom with the judge.
Yeah.
It's a major plot, it's a plot point, but I mean, in which you say you want to live with your mother. The judge asks you, and I remember feeling incredible relief when you were given to your dad.
Interesting. I mean,
You're surprised by that.
What's fascinating is, the reactions to the book. I mean, this is hey, from my perspective, if my brothers had written a book, it would have been a different book from their perspective. My mother had written a book, it certainly would have been a different book. Though I draw from her diary, I should mention that I'll get into it at some point later. I draw from her diaries, which I inherited, which she kept meticulously. But the reactions to the book, although well received in general, I'm happy about the reviews and everything. Extraordinary wide range of reactions to my mother. Mm-hmm. From, wow, what an amazing mom, she's my hero, to she's a monster, to awful, hedonistic, narcissistic, should have been locked up, the full range. And I even, the New York Times printed an op-ed of mine about the book on Mother's Day. And it was written in a way of sort of, I now kind of appreciate some things about my childhood that I didn't necessarily appreciate as much earlier, and so on. I got some hate mail on Mother's Day saying, your mom was a loser. Your mom, but here's the interesting thing. I'm not going to gender stereotype here, but for the most part, the people who admire my mother and say wonderful things about her are women. And the people who are most critical are men. And I gave a talk at a bookstore about the book launch events, and one man in the audience who was probably around my father's age, maybe a little younger, he could not stop bitterly giving a monologue about how he lost children to his free love wife who left him and took the kids, and so it really hits personally. And I think for some, it's interesting that men react more negatively than women in general. I'm generalizing, but it's quite striking.
I must say, I think I reacted that way in particular when she took you to Chile and then basically left you in a small village without running water for months while she went off to pursue the revolution.
That might have been one of them. That's
but
right.
Here's the interesting point. That was probably the happiest moment of my life.
But then
of the book. I mean,
not to have a
basically,
therapy session right now,
No.
Peter. But then doesn't that say something?
At that point, this was a farm in Chile where it's a great, collective farm, socialist collective farm named Che Guevara. And she leaves me there while she runs around Chile writing her book and researching her book. And I'm living with this family on the farm and tending to the goats and sheep and horses and getting up early and rounding the cattle. And this was fun. I never had to shower if I didn't want to. Playing in the streets with the kids. The coup wiped out everything. I thought my mother might be dead. I had no idea how to reach my father. So it went from being this kind of fun, I wouldn't call it summer camp, but it was basically, this was a highlight of the book. No, I think it's more of a mixed story in terms of is when, we share one room with her Peruvian lover turned husband for months on end, and I have to live through their continuous all day, all night arguing and so on. And, yes, right. It says, right.
Let me take us in a slightly different direction, because there are some other interesting points about that I would like to touch on. Both of your mothers tried to shield you from American popular culture and consumer culture.
Absolutely.
Right, and they fought really hard. So Saida, maybe you could tell us a little about your reaction to your participation in the grape boycott.
Oh, right. Well, yes.
It's grapes, not lettuce.
Grapes,
That's
right. So yeah, the grape and iceberg lettuce boycott, we remember that, right? In which I was not, no one was, I was not permitted to eat grape. I was 4 years old. But it became a huge conflict between my mother and I, where we would go to the supermarket and there would be all the grapes, and I would see everybody else was buying grapes. How come we can't eat grapes? And so she actually allowed me to eat grapes only when I was in the store, so I could
steal them.
That's right, I could steal them, which in some ways is accelerating the revolution, right? Because now the supermarket is going to lose money, and et cetera, et cetera.
Steal from the rich.
But yeah, then I also talk about that it's that's a tough that's a tough lesson to be giving a child. Like, what are you teaching the child there? That what rules am I following? And I knew, and this is how my childhood was. That I've always felt that I was on the outside of everything. Mm-hmm. That whatever was whatever was the thing that Americans were happy about or approving of, I was supposed to be against it. Mm-hmm. You actually talk about when Reagan got shot in your class. Yes.
Yeah, I was.
That's right.
First 10th grade, history class. Someone runs into the classroom and tells the teacher that Reagan's just been shot. He announces it to the class, and I just instinctively, I raise my hands and scream out, "Yes!" And the entire class turns to me like I'm some heretic, and the teacher never quite let me forget it. And he ended up being my teacher for many other classes, but that was a great example of just being totally on the outside, but feeling special.
What's that?
But on the outside always, but made by your mother to feel like you're special because you're on the outside.
Right.
Well,
but
you're in the know.
Of course, I'm in the know,
everyone's in the-
but I
right.
also I better not think differently than her, because then I will be on the outs. So I felt, and not that it's overt. Not that it was ever stated this way, but I knew that that I had to conform to that way of thinking.
Yeah. My mother just drilled into me, words she thought were, things you just don't want to become as an opportunist and an elitist.
Right.
And so when I was in the worst junior high school, and so my choir teacher wanted me to transfer when I go to high school to the best public high school in the city. And my mother purposefully wanted me to go to the worst public high school in the city because it's working class Chicano school. And kids there don't go on to college, they don't graduate, whatever. It was with the other school where where my choir teacher was getting me to go to, they go into college. So I have this dialogue based on her diaries and where she's basically chastising me for wanting these things and saying that's what your father would have had no problems you going to this school, and so yeah, no, apparently I did get the transfer. I won out. I put my foot down. It was East High School in Denver, Colorado, best high school in the city, and still is. Yeah, so no, it was great. In fact, one of the book talks I gave on the book was at Tattered Cover Bookstore on East Colfax, right across the street from my old high school. And my high school English teacher was there, and the mother of my prom date was there, and it was special. It was special. Yeah. Anyway.
Speaking of being alienated from the culture, your father went back to Iran after the revolution. He ran for president in Iran.
Jailed.
Spend time, right? And so and yet you were in the United States at the time when the hostage situation occurred, and you were in school at the time. So tell us a little about
That's
that
so funny,
experience.
Andy. I totally have blocked that out of my mind. Yes, Iran hostage.
If you write it down, people are going to know about it.
Iran hostage crisis, 1979. My dad does the reverse commute. He goes back. He goes to Iran, and then he runs for president. This was not this was my Ray. Yes, Ray. So I made it clear, as my mother informed me to do, that I supported the hostage takers. Thank you.
I don't remember.
Right? Because that's not
Yeah.
1979, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You do not want to say when you're 10 years old in middle school that you're right. So, what's that? Which is something else where our stories diverge also, because I have the ethnicity thing that I'm dealing with, which I have the crazy name that Andy did such a fine job of attempting to pronounce.
Never again.
But yet I'm growing up with my mother, who I don't think I've mentioned is Jewish American, from Mount Vernon, New York. She's raising me, but everybody assumes I'm Iranian, but I don't know anything about Iran because I didn't grow up with my dad. I barely know my dad. Never been to Iran, and yet that's supposed to be my connection. But then I also felt, and I don't know if you had this as well, but I felt intense allegiance to my father, the man I didn't know. So during the hostage crisis, all the anti-Iranian sentiment that was out there in the world, I took it incredibly personally, because it felt like you're mocking me, you're mocking my father, but you're also mocking my mother, who is still in love with my father. Like that's it all felt very shameful to me. So that's really began, I think, more so than the grapes, my alienation from society, which I think maybe I'm just finally clawing my way back into. But yeah, it's tough.
As you mentioned, your father basically walked away from your life, and you had very little contact with him. So one could say you had no choice but to stay with your mother and be raised by your mother. But that's not your case, Peter, because you actually were offered the opportunity to live with your father essentially in a very nice, comfortable suburban home with the material things that you had not had before and enjoyed. Why did you ultimately decide to stay with your mother?
No, it was the quintessential, comfortable, middle class, middle America, suburban home, and I was living it because my father had one custody. I was living with him and my stepmother, who was lovely, and fitting in at school, learning. I learned English writing late, actually, so I was finally catching up a little bit. I'd skipped some grades and missed some grades earlier. And this was making my mother incredibly stressed out and nervous that I was basically selling out. And so she at age 10.
At age 10.
Right, at age 10. And so she would write me these really heavy letters, some of which I quote in the book, basically telling me, if you stay there, you're a sellout. And it's so this was guilt with a capital G. Having said that, she intensively loved me, and she could not imagine. You asked if she was depressed. She got extraordinarily depressed when she lost me in that court battle. Her diaries are just heavy, and she's freaking out. And so basically, the judge, I have no idea why my mother thought the judge would give me to her. In retrospect, it's weird. Anyway, she lost me, but then she took matters into her own hands, and I had to collude in my own kidnapping because she basically said, meet me in front of the school, noon, during recess, and so I snuck out there, and she was hiding in a wig, and we dashed across the border to Canada. but I had to collude. And so you asked, well, why did I do it? Well, it was kind of maybe a twisted logic, but there was a logic to it, which was I want my first preference is to be with both my parents. Most kids want that, right? They want to spend time with both. In fact, I think I told the judge, hey, how about half the year with one and half the year with the other? Nope, doesn't work that way. So then I told him, I said, well, I should stay with my mother because basically it was clear to me she needed me. My father wanted me intensively, and he fought for me for years and years and years. And I have all that correspondence from him about that. But I knew his life was fine without me. I mean, he was stable, had his wife. My mother was, with a very volatile, unpredictable. She was 41. She had a 22, 23-year-old, Peruvian husband who only married him so that they could travel to the United States together. So I basically made the calculus that she needed me more than my father did. I also I'd lived my whole life with her, and it was hard to imagine her going back to Peru, which was the plan, without me. That I really would be completely isolated from her.
Eventually, Saeed, your mother left the Socialist Workers' Party. Why?
Yeah, well, a big part of my mother's life was that she had always wanted to be a writer. And that instead of writing, she tried to make a working class revolution. It took all of her time and energy, and 1984 about, when I was 16, she just, somebody had said to her, did you ever think about what you would do with all that time if you left the party? And her eye, I don't know, she had some epiphany and resigned and then tried to become a writer. It was always, she would take classes, she had been an English literature major in college, and this is before joining the Socialist Workers' Party.
And her brother is a noted writer.
That's right, and her brother's Mark Harris, who wrote famously Bang the Drum Slowly. So, she was fashioning herself after him. One other...
Because your father is the one who radicalized her.
I think the Socialist Workers' Party radicalized them both.
They both, right.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think it was his influence. I mean, for all I know, maybe she radicalized him. I don't know. Yep. But here's something else. Here's another major parallel: is that she kept a journal, a daily journal, and I did not consult it, but like your mother, who kept a journal.
Could have you consulted it?
What's that?
Could have you consulted it?
It would have been. I would have had to ask her.
So she was still alive, right?
Yes. So when I was writing it, and one of the things I did when I was writing my memoir was I did not want to involve my parents, my brother, and my sister. I didn't want to say, "Hey, Mom, can you help me understand such and such story, so that then I can write it and throw you under the bus." You know what I mean? Like I didn't want to have her be culpable. So I said, "Let me just go from my own memory." She has since donated, she's still alive, but she's since donated all of her journals to the University of Delaware, which is where her brother Mark, all of his papers are. So they have taken in her journals. And I'm talking about, it's
have you read them?
What's that?
Have you read them?
No, I have not been to the university.
No, her journals. Have you
No,
read
no, no. I'd have to go there.
Wow.
They'd be really heavy, man.
Yes.
They'd be... You hear how he said that? He said, "Yes, do it."
Yeah.
No, I don't want that heaviness.
Wow.
They're very sad. It's a very.
Okay.
My mother had a very sad life, and which I lived
Right.
with her, and then I don't know if I want to relive it so much again.
Right.
One thing I did consult though, and work on the book, I did go to the University of Delaware. So this is pre my mother donating the journals, and I discovered when I'm looking through my uncle's archive. I discovered like 40 years worth of letters between the two of them. And this was incredibly illuminating because that's where I learned that my mother at age 24, out of college, was envisioning a certain kind of life. Oh, I might go to France. I might try to go there, be a novelist. She had these ideas and my uncle was trying to counsel her. Right. And what was incredibly sad for me reading these was to know that what the outcome would be, which was that none of this was going to come to fruition.
Well, here's just maybe one of the clearest differences between our books. Is he knew about the journals, and he purposely stayed away from them, and still does. In my case, my mother died suddenly, unexpectedly. I discovered her journal next to her bed where she had died the night before. The last line in her journal when I opened it up was, "Uh-oh, I think I'm having a heart attack. What to do?" That was the last thing she wrote. And I was not estranged from my mother, but we were distant, including geographically. I was focused on, academic career on the East Coast, and she was in Colorado, and I only saw her once or twice a year at most. And so my way of catching up with my mother and keeping her alive was to read that journal. I took all the journals, over 100 journals, notebooks over 30 years, and I read backwards in time. And it was then it hit me. I said, this is, this is an archive of material to work with. I could not have conceived of, I wouldn't have had the self-confidence to write this book if I didn't have those journals, which I quote and I use and I weave through the story. And so I ended up, first I used them as information for the book, and then at some one point I said, no, her voice has to come through in this book. So I actually quote from there and create dialogue based on the journal entries. And so I couldn't have done it if she's still alive, because she wouldn't have given me her journals, if she was still alive.
Let's open up for some questions from the audience. If you'll wait for the microphone to come, that would be great. Let's start in the back.
This is for Peter. Given how you were traveling all over the place when you were very young, how did your education happen that you were able to go on and get, a college degree and graduate and a PhD? And
Right.
I mean, it sounds like your formative years. I mean, when you were on that farm, you weren't going to a school at all, I assume.
No, I did go briefly to a Catholic nun school, but I tried to go as little as possible, frankly. I was having more fun on the farm. No, my schooling was just extraordinarily uneven and bad, for the early years. And what changed my life were teachers later on. Teachers were hugely important. This choir teacher in junior high basically directing me to go to the best school rather. My science teacher, I forget, I tell the story in the book about my science teacher in 7th grade. He basically arranges for me to skip a grade because he's so impressed at my, science report.
Which you plagiarized.
Which I plagiarized. And I didn't know what plagiarism was. It was totally innocent.
He didn't know he couldn't just copy straight from the book.
I just copied from the encyclopedia what teeth are. And, this was an anti-drug paper, which is funny because I now write about drug issues. But my last point I want to make, which is important, here's where the stable, responsible father comes in, which is, yes, I'm going to a good high school, a public high school, but I could not have imagined going to college, certainly an expensive East Coast private school, without my father having the entire time saved money and put an educational trust fund in my name.
And actually, let me just ask, just to follow up, can you just talk briefly about your literacy? Because you did not know how to write until you were significantly older.
Right. Yeah. I basically, it's hard for me to believe now because my Spanish is not that great, but I learned how to read and write Spanish before English. And actually, in terms of actually being able to write, I didn't know cursive writing until maybe 10 years old. And I didn't read English until around then too. So I played major catch up.
Let's come up to the front, and we'll start here on the end.
Hi. Saeed, this is a question for you. You said about the hostage situation, the first political act of the Islamic Republic of Iran. You supported it. I'm wondering about your relationship to. Now, of course, Sunni Islam is different than Shia, et cetera. But over your lifetime, you've seen, Islam has morphed from a religion to a political system. Certainly, as practiced now in the ISIS variety and all of that. So, what is and you mentioned your mother being, a Jewish American. What was your relationship to Islam, and how do you look at it today?
None. I had no relationship to Islam.
So you're
whatsoever.
So
I'm-
you're
And it's
supportive
hardly mentioned
of-
in the book, right?
Right. Well, so, I mean, we were communists, so that means our religion was atheism.
Right.
And my dad, who would have been the Muslim, if I had lived with him, he was an atheist too.
Right.
He didn't do, neither of my parents grew up religious, neither of them practiced religion.
So he was
in
able to run as an apostate?
Sure, right, because this is pre-Khomeini. This is 1980, so Khomeini is in power, but there was more political liberalism then. There were 120, not to diminish my dad's achievement of running for president, but there were also 120 other candidates that were running too. So, did he win?
Yeah, pass that to you.
I wonder how both of you would rewrite your lives if you could redo your lives over again. What would you change, if anything?
You know, it's funny. I did not write this book with a poor me tone. You know, like, oh, look, let me tell you this story, how bad it was, you know, and regrets. It's not a regretful book. It's not like, oh man, I wish I'd done it this, or wish she'd done this differently, or, you know, sure, I could have done without her, you know, fewer lovers, and the living conditions were awful, and sometimes frankly, okay, the one thing, the low point of my childhood was being kidnapped, and having the torture. I was happily living with my father and stepmother, but I also wanted to live with my mother, and the emotional torture of having to act. I was 10, having to actually decide to break the law, flee the country, and go back to slums outside of Lima, Peru, and my father having no clue where we are, and I wouldn't be in touch with him for years. That was tough. And so in the overall scheme of things, not a lot of regrets, frankly, but that piece of it would hit hard, yeah.
How much time do you have? I mean, what are we doing? Listen, but yes, I would. You know what? I'll give you the short answer. Have a father, not necessarily my father, by biological, but to have a father in my life. Yeah. So that's where I would start, and then we'll. I do not. That's a very good question. He has not read the book, and he has not spoken to me since it came out because you know why? He said it was an attack on the working class. He lives in Brooklyn.
Peter, two questions. You said you put your foot down when you decided to go to the better high school. So that was really against your mother's wishes because she vehemently wanted you to go to the lesser school.
Yes.
And yet you decided to put your foot down. That's number one question. What made you choose really to do that?
Right.
And secondly, since you've read all of the journals,
Yeah.
do you feel that it colored some of your memories, that things that, or how you remembered specific incidents
Right.
and experiences really weren't as they happened at all, but that were revised or illuminated by reading your mother's journals?
Yeah. And the first part of the question is, you're right, I put my foot down. It was a decisive moment, a fork in the road, right? And I will go to the worst school or the best school in town. And it's the teachers, right? The teachers were the ones, urging me on. And I made the argument to my mother, which was basically, look, I'm not asking to go to a private school or a suburban white kids school. I just this school I go to was actually 40% white, 60%, African American, Latino, and Asian. It was very integrated, inner city schools, but it was a very good high school. But the point is that I knew deep down that the move to that school wasn't a radical departure from, the correct political line, which is, but I knew that it was a dead end to go to the worst school in town. And so, No, we talked it out. I mean, basically, I needed her signature for the transfer request. So she had to, I could not have done it without her finally relenting and accepting that.
But you weren't exactly candid with her about your reasons, as I recall.
Oh, yes, there's a, I played it. Yep. Okay, my choir, now it's coming back. It's in the book. It's in the book. My choir teacher said, look, East High has a special voice class, because I was a singer, and though you'd hardly believe it now. And only that school offers it. And so that will be the basis of the transfer. So I told my mother, I said, look, I got to go to this school. Forget that it's the best school in town. Ignore that. Let's ignore that. We're going to focus on, I need this voice class. And because I sing, and she liked it that I sang. And actually in Peru, I did street theater and all kinds of stuff with. And so that was the rationale. And once I got to that school, I never took that class.
So we have time for only a couple more questions. I want to go to this side of the room. Let's go here first. Oh, sorry.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. There was a second part of the question. Oh, yes. You know, this is where I kind of, I can't imagine writing that book without some kind of written record, even if it's tainted in just her account. It brought stuff back. I could relive it through the journals. It was interactive. So yeah, sure, some of my memories about certain things were very different than hers. You know, she overall had a much sort of rosier, upbeat understanding of my childhood than I did. And, you know, huge chunks of the journals were purely about politics and stuff. And so, you know, not about me and my brothers and family issues. And so I kind of fast forwarded through some of that stuff. So, but yeah, there's differences. Sometimes they clarified my memories, brought them back in ways that wouldn't have been so clear. Sometimes purely informational, like where we lived at what date and what time, the name of the street and the color of the house and, you know, all that. Otherwise, how do I get that stuff into the book? My memory's not that good otherwise.
Thank you. Let's go over here. Thanks.
I have 3 short questions for Saeed. They're interrelated. About your parents, how old were they when they met and where did they meet? And also, were your maternal grandparents involved in radical politics in any way?
So they met in Minneapolis and at the University of Minnesota when they were in their, they would have been in college. So I guess early 20s. And then the question is about my grandparents. Yes. What's that? Someone said what did you say? The farmer's market? What? Oh. But she's actually going back further. She wants to know about like in her childhood, what were her parents? Yeah, that's right. No, the short answer is no. There was not radical politics. But her father was he was a lawyer, and he was incredibly litigious. He actually ended up getting, when I say he was a lawyer and he was also a real estate owner in New York. He was a landlord. He ended up getting disbarred. I looked up some of his records. He had constant lawsuits going on with various people. Psychologically, I think that kind of upbringing had an effect on my mother. Somebody who's combative. It's that I've often thought that it didn't necessarily have to be communist politics. There would have been something that my parents would have gotten involved in. They're both very angry people. They needed some outlet for rebel against something, yeah, but they needed some outlet for some anger that was within them, because there's one thing about communists. We're angry people, okay? And the Socialist Workers' Party found a way to channel that and also exacerbate it.
I wonder, just quickly here, you tend to, you make a big deal in your book about how little you actually know and understand about politics. So you actually didn't learn, despite this political upbringing, you don't seem to have absorbed very much content.
Well, since you put it like that, Andy.
I'm sorry, I'm an academic.
That's right. We knew, and I say we because I feel like members of the Socialist Workers' Party don't really know what they're talking about. you know how to talk around something. You know how to, you know certain really good either catchphrases or point to certain historical moments. I've noticed this with my dad. He's really good at like, you know, you realize you're talking to him but he hasn't quite said anything yet. And you also, and this is a big thing, you're pretty much always talking to people who agree with you. So you are never pushed that far. Now, when you start talking to somebody who doesn't agree with you, we'll engage a little bit, and then at some point we realize you're a complete waste of my time. I'm never going to convert you to the revolution. I've got to move on. So once I became more mainstream and I got out into the world and I started to test my communist philosophy, and let me say this anecdote. My girlfriend at the time, now my wife, we're walking through Queens. We've just started dating. She knows I'm I used to say I'm a communist. She says to me, huh? So she's from Paramus, New Jersey. She doesn't know anything about communism. She says, so she says to me, she goes, so does that mean under communism, will I be able to buy beauty products? And I went,
You were both working for Martha Stewart.
right, we were also both working for Martha Stewart. That's a whole other story. No, so she says to me, will I be able to buy beauty products? And I go, of course, yeah, of course you'll be able to buy beauty, all the beauty products you want. And then she's asked me something else. And then I'm starting to go, I say, well, I don't know. She goes, what's the difference between communism and socialism? I said, I don't know. She asked me the question, I said, I don't know. Then I go, and I'm just kind of thinking aloud, and I go, you know what, that sounds like I don't know what I'm talking about, right? Which was supposed to be her cue to go, oh, no, you're very knowledgeable. I'm not kidding. She says to me, and she's being very genuine, she says, yeah, it sounds like you don't know what you're talking about. And I realized, I'm not kidding, this was my epiphany. I realized I had my entire life swallowed something whole and never considered anything for myself. This goes back to the earlier thing about, is it a cult? You just tell me what's true. Whatever you tell me is true, I will say is true. I had never learned how to think for myself. I don't know how the hell we got on that, but
We have time for only one more question, so let me just go over to this side. You've been in the orange up front. It's coming.
Thank you. Economically, I'm just wondering how your mother's supported you, especially Peter with. Yeah, and Peter, especially with the international travel. I'm just wondering how was that paid for?
Yeah. Well, part of the answer is that we lived dirt poor, and sometimes more dirt poor than other times, but basically incredibly modest living my entire childhood. When she left my father very suddenly, but then took us 3 kids to California, she had left a tenure-track academic job in Michigan, so she had some savings. And I think she also had some help from her parents. When we went to Berkeley, we formed a commune, and she collected rent from the other members of the commune, but we lived on very, little, to make the milk go further, we mixed in powdered milk and so on. Here's the thing, part of the reason we came back and had that trial where she lost custody of me, the only reason she came back to the States and risked losing custody of me was she was desperate for a financial settlement with my father because they'd never had a settlement. So my father said, fine, but the custody of Peter has to be part of the court decision. So she actually got a chunk of money from that court case, even though she lost me. So she got, a chunk, tens of thousands of dollars from that, which if you're living on nothing in Peru, that goes a long ways. When we came back to the US, she changed her name so that we were kind of living in hiding from my father, but she had a PhD in sociology, so she taught adjunct teaching at various community colleges, but she also was, a janitor, a waitress, did rooms for Hilton, drove cars at a car auction. She did all kinds of part-time, short-term jobs at various points.
mine is not as complicated. My mother was a secretary for 30 years at Carnegie Mellon. And here's one last thing where we diverge, is your mother in the book never seems to be afraid of either finding a job or making a living somehow. I mean, there's that money scare where she needs to go and do the settlement. But my mother lived always in fear of losing her home. And we also lived modestly. That's a nice word. We weren't quite living like you were, with no sanitation, no running water. There's
In some places,
yeah, some
Right.
places. So, yes, so secretary.
Well, I'd like you to join me in thanking our two authors tonight. There are copies of their books upstairs for sale, which they will be signing, and I hope you got the sense, they're great stories, they're very readable, they're both remarkably readable books, and you'll definitely enjoy, it's worth reading them both. Thank you.